The silence that followed the Nobel Committee's call stretched through my parents' dining room like a physical presence. 23 family members, gathered for what was supposed to be my cousin Elena's engagement celebration, stared at me with expressions ranging from shock to disbelief to something approaching terror. My father's fork hung suspended halfway to his mouth. A piece of my mother's famous tres leches cake balanced precariously on the tines. His declaration about my worthless research still echoed in the air, competing with the voice on my phone that had just congratulated me on winning the Nobel Prize in Physics. "I'm sorry," I said into the phone, stepping away from the table slightly. "Could you repeat that?" The connection seemed unclear. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and unmistakably Swedish. "Dr. Martinez, this is Secretary General Anderson from the Nobel Committee. I'm calling to formally inform you that you have been awarded this year's Nobel Prize in Physics for your groundbreaking work on quantum gravity theory and its applications to understanding dark matter." My mother's wine glass slipped from her fingers, the crystal shattering against her good china plate. The red wine spread across the white tablecloth like blood, but nobody moved to clean it up. Everyone was too busy staring at me with the expression of people watching their understanding of reality undergo fundamental reconstruction. "I see," I said calmly into the phone. "I'm honored by the committee's decision." Secretary General Anderson continued with the formal details: the ceremony in Stockholm, the media requirements, the $1 million prize, while my family sat frozen around the dining room table like figures in a very expensive tableau. When I ended the call, the silence was absolute. My father was the first to break. But you're unemployed," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've been living in our basement for 2 years working on whatever it is you do on that computer." It was true that I'd been living in my childhood bedroom since completing my postdoctoral fellowship at CERN. What my family didn't understand was that theoretical physics research doesn't require a traditional office. It requires time, computational resources, and the freedom to think about problems that might not have solutions. Living rent-free in my parents' basement had provided exactly the stability I needed to focus on the mathematics that govern the universe's most fundamental mysteries. My sister Carmen, who'd been notably quiet during the evening's earlier discussion of my career failures, was staring at her phone screen with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. "Miguel," she said slowly, "it says here that Dr. Miguel Martinez is a theoretical physicist who solved the unified field theory problem." She looked up at me. That's you." I nodded. The dark matter calculations took longer than expected, but the mathematics finally worked out last spring. My uncle Roberto, who owned a successful construction company and had spent most of dinner explaining why practical work was more valuable than playing with equations, was reading what appeared to be a news article on his phone. "It says here that your research explains how 95% of the universe works." His voice carried the tone of someone discovering that gravity might actually flow upward. "How is that possible?" The research had indeed focused on the universe's missing mass, the dark matter and dark energy that comprised most of reality but remained invisible to conventional observation. The mathematical framework I'd developed provided a unified explanation for how these mysterious components interacted with ordinary matter, effectively bridging the gap between quantum mechanics and general relativity that had puzzled physicists for nearly a century. But explaining all of that to people who'd just spent 2 hours discussing my lack of employment seemed somewhat challenging. My cousin Elena, whose engagement we were supposedly celebrating, had apparently forgotten about her own party. "Miguel, I'm looking at your Wikipedia page," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It says you published papers in Physical Review Letters, Nature and Science, and that you've been working on this research since you were a graduate student at MIT. My mother, who'd been advocating for practical employment just minutes earlier, was staring at her phone with the expression of someone watching their fundamental assumptions about reality undergo systematic demolition. "It says here that you have a PhD from MIT and that you did postdoctoral work at CERN." She looked at me with something approaching awe. "When did you go to Switzerland?" "I spent 3 years there," I said simply, working with the Large Hadron Collider team to test some of the theoretical predictions. The revelation seemed to multiply rather than resolve the family's confusion. My father, who'd been so certain about my research being worthless, was conducting what appeared to be a frantic Google search. "Miguel," he said slowly, "it says here that CERN is where they discovered the Higgs boson. and that you were part of the theoretical team that predicted its properties. I'd actually contributed to the mathematical framework that helped identify the Higgs field's characteristics, but that work had been part of a much larger collaborative effort involving thousands of scientists. The Nobel Prize was being awarded specifically for my subsequent research into dark matter interactions, which had been a more solitary endeavor. Elena was reading what appeared to be a university press release. It says MIT considers you one of their most distinguished alumni, and that your research has been cited over 15,000 times by other scientists. She looked around the table. 15,000 citations means that other researchers are building on your work to advance human knowledge. My cousin David, who'd been explaining earlier why I needed to get serious about life, was scrolling through what appeared to be academic articles. I can't understand any of this, he admitted, but it looks like you've basically rewritten how we understand the universe. The unified field theory had indeed required rethinking some fundamental assumptions about how matter and energy interacted at cosmic scales. The mathematics was elegant in its simplicity, but it had taken 15 years of work to arrive at equations that could explain everything from quantum particle behavior to galactic rotation curves. Roberta was reading what appeared to be a news analysis piece. It says here that your research could lead to revolutionary advances in energy production and space travel. He looked at me with something approaching reverence. Are you going to change how humans live? The practical applications were still theoretical, but the mathematical framework suggested possibilities that had seemed like science fiction just decades earlier. Understanding how dark matter influenced space-time geometry could potentially lead to new forms of propulsion and energy generation, though those engineering challenges would require decades of additional work. My Aunt Sophia, who'd been notably vocal about my need to find steady employment, was reading what appeared to be a financial analysis of Nobel Prize winners. Miguel, she said quietly, it says here that Nobel laureates often become very wealthy through speaking engagements, consulting work, and book deals. She paused. And that the prize comes with $1 million. The money was significant, but it was also secondary to the scientific recognition. The Nobel Prize represented validation from the international physics community that the work had fundamental importance for human understanding of reality. Carmen was reading what appeared to be a biography. It says you started working on unified field theory as a 25-year-old graduate student, and that other physicists thought the problem was unsolvable. She looked at me with something approaching disbelief. You spent 15 years working on something that everyone said was impossible? The impossibility had been part of the appeal. Physics was full of problems that seemed intractable until someone developed the right mathematical tools to address them. Einstein's relativity, quantum mechanics, the Standard Model, all of these breakthrough theories had initially seemed too radical to be correct. My father was reading what appeared to be a timeline of my academic career. Son, he said slowly, it says here that you graduated summa cum laude from Harvard, completed your PhD at MIT in record time, and were recruited by CERN before you turned 30. He looked at me with the expression of someone discovering that their child had been leading a double life. Why didn't you ever tell us any of this? The question was fair. I'd been living in their basement for 2 years, contributing occasionally to household expenses with consulting work, while keeping my research activities largely private. The family had interpreted my quiet lifestyle as evidence of career failure, when in reality I'd been focusing intensively on mathematical problems that required extended periods of uninterrupted thought. Elena found a video interview I'd given to Scientific American the previous year. Miguel, you're explaining quantum gravity like it's basic arithmetic. She looked around the table. I took 2 years of college physics and I can't understand anything you're saying. David was reading what appeared to be a university press release about my research funding. It says here that you've received grants totaling over $8 million from the National Science Foundation, NASA, and the Department of Energy. He looked at me with something approaching awe. That's more money than most people see in their entire lives. The federal funding had been essential for the computational resources needed to test the theoretical predictions. Dark matter research required sophisticated mathematical modeling that pushed the limits of available supercomputing capacity. Sophia was reading what appeared to be a news article about potential Nobel Prize winners. Miguel, it says here that you've been considered a leading candidate for the physics prize for the past 3 years. She looked at me with something between amazement and accusation. Did you know this was coming? The speculation had been flattering but also somewhat distracting. Nobel Prize predictions were notoriously unreliable, and I tried not to pay attention to the annual media coverage of potential winners. The scientific work itself was the reward. The recognition, while meaningful, was secondary to the satisfaction of solving problems that had puzzled humanity for generations. Roberto found a documentary that featured my research. There's a whole section about how unified field theory could revolutionize space exploration and energy production. He looked at me with something approaching reverence. Are you basically helping to build the future? My mother, who'd been advocating for practical employment, was reading what appeared to be an analysis of the physics job market. It says here that theoretical physicists with your credentials typically earn salaries in the high six figures, and that major universities compete aggressively to recruit Nobel laureates. She looked at me with something approaching disbelief. You could probably work anywhere you want. The employment opportunities were indeed extensive, but they were also somewhat irrelevant to the research itself. The mathematics of unified field theory didn't depend on institutional affiliation or salary negotiations. It depended on asking the right questions about how reality was constructed at its most fundamental level. Elena was reading what appeared to be a comparison of Nobel Prize winners by age. Miguel, it says here that you're the youngest physicist to win the prize in over 40 years. She looked around the table. And that your research is considered one of the most important theoretical advances since Einstein's relativity. The comparison to Einstein was generous but not entirely inaccurate. Unified field theory did represent a similar leap in understanding to what relativity had provided in the early 20th century. Both theories required abandoning intuitive assumptions about how reality worked in favor of mathematical descriptions that initially seemed too strange to be true. Carmen found a video of my Nobel Prize announcement. They're calling your work a revolutionary contribution to human understanding of the cosmos, she read aloud, and saying that it fundamentally changes how physicists think about the universe. My father, who'd declared my research worthless less than 30 minutes earlier, was staring at his phone with the expression of someone whose understanding of the world had undergone complete reconstruction. Miguel, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. We all do. The way we talked about your work, your career, we were completely wrong. I considered his words carefully. The family's concern about my employment status hadn't been entirely unreasonable. Theoretical physics was indeed an uncertain career path, and many brilliant researchers struggled to find stable positions. Their criticism had come from a place of caring, even if their understanding of academic research had been somewhat limited. You weren't wrong to be concerned, I said gently. Theoretical physics is a difficult field, and most research doesn't lead to breakthrough discoveries. I was fortunate that the mathematics worked out. Roberto was reading what appeared to be an analysis of the practical implications of my research. It says here that your unified field theory could lead to new forms of energy that make fossil fuels obsolete. He looked at me with something approaching disbelief. Are you going to save the planet? The environmental applications were promising but still decades away from practical implementation. Understanding how dark energy influenced cosmic expansion could potentially lead to new approaches to energy generation, but the engineering challenges remained formidable. David found a news article about the Nobel Prize ceremony. Miguel, it says here that you'll be meeting with the King of Sweden and giving a lecture to the international physics community. He looked at me with something approaching awe. You're going to be famous. The ceremony would indeed involve significant public attention, but that wasn't really the purpose of the research. Physics was about understanding how reality worked, not about achieving celebrity status. The Nobel Prize was meaningful because it represented recognition from the scientific community that the work had contributed something valuable to human knowledge. Sophia was reading what appeared to be a financial analysis of Nobel Prize winners. It says here that Nobel laureates often become very wealthy through consulting work, speaking engagements, and commercial applications of their research. She paused. Miguel, are you going to be rich? The commercial potential was substantial but uncertain. Unified field theory could indeed lead to revolutionary technologies, but the timeline for practical applications was measured in decades rather than years. The immediate value was intellectual rather than financial. We now understood something about the universe that had been mysterious since the beginning of human civilization. My mother approached with the careful expression of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. Miguel, she said quietly, I have to ask. When we would suggest that you needed to find practical work, when we would worry about your future, what were you thinking? The question struck at the heart of the disconnect that had characterized family gatherings for the past several years. While my parents had been concerned about my employment prospects, I'd been focused on mathematical problems that might not have solutions. The research had been all-consuming in the best possible way. Every day brought new insights into how the universe functioned at its most fundamental level. I was usually thinking about dark matter equations, I said honestly. The mathematics required complete focus, and I was fortunate to have the time and space to work without distraction. Elena was reading what appeared to be a timeline of major physics breakthroughs. Miguel, it says here that unified field theory is being compared to Newton's laws of motion and Einstein's relativity. She looked around the table. You've basically made a discovery that will be remembered for centuries. The historical significance was humbling rather than gratifying. Physics advanced through the accumulated work of thousands of researchers building on each other's insights across generations. My contribution had been to develop mathematical tools that could bridge the gap between quantum mechanics and relativity, but that work had only been possible because of the foundation laid by countless previous scientists. Carmen found a video of physicists discussing the implications of my research. They're saying that your work opens up entirely new fields of study and that it will take decades for the physics community to fully explore the implications. She looked at me with something approaching disbelief. You've basically given humanity a new way to understand reality. My father, who'd been so certain about the worthlessness of theoretical research, was reading what appeared to be an explanation of unified field theory written for general audiences. Son, he said slowly, I'm trying to understand what you actually discovered, but the concepts are... He paused, apparently searching for words. Beyond what most people need to think about, I finished. The mathematics describes how matter and energy interact at cosmic scales, but it doesn't have much relevance to daily life. Roberto was reading what appeared to be a news analysis of the Nobel Prize announcement. It says here that your research represents the most significant theoretical advance in physics since the discovery of quantum mechanics. He looked at me with something approaching reverence. How does someone even begin to think about problems like that? The process had been less dramatic than it might sound. Unified field theory had emerged from asking simple questions about why the universe behaved differently at different scales. Why did quantum mechanics work for small particles while relativity described large objects? The mathematics that answered those questions had required years of work, but the underlying curiosity was straightforward. David found an article about the commercial potential of my research. Miguel, it says here that major tech companies and government agencies are already trying to recruit you for consulting work. He paused. And that the patent applications related to your research could be worth billions of dollars. The intellectual property questions were complex but largely irrelevant to the scientific work itself. Unified field theory was a mathematical description of how reality functioned. It belonged to humanity rather than to any individual or organization. Sophia was reading what appeared to be a comparison of Nobel Prize winners' subsequent careers. It says here that Nobel laureates typically become extremely influential in their fields and often advise governments on scientific policy. She looked at me with something approaching awe. You're going to help shape how humanity develops technologically. The policy implications were indeed significant. Understanding how dark matter and dark energy influenced cosmic evolution could inform everything from space exploration strategies to energy research priorities. But those conversations would involve the broader scientific community rather than individual decision-making. My mother, who'd been advocating for practical employment throughout dinner, was staring at a photo of the Nobel Prize medal. Miguel, she said quietly, I have to admit, this is completely beyond anything I imagined was possible. She paused. When you were a child, you were always asking questions about how things worked, but I never thought that it would lead to understanding how the universe works. Elena suggested. She'd apparently become the family's designated interpreter of scientific achievement. The childhood curiosity had indeed been the foundation for everything that followed. Physics was essentially about asking increasingly sophisticated versions of the same questions that children ask naturally. Why do things fall down? Why is the sky blue? Why do stars shine? The mathematics required to answer those questions at a professional level was complex, but the underlying motivation was universal human curiosity. Carmen found a documentary about dark matter research that featured my work. Miguel, they're explaining how your research solves mysteries that have puzzled scientists for decades. She looked around the table. You've basically answered questions about 95% of the universe that no one understood before. The percentage was accurate. Dark matter and dark energy comprised the vast majority of reality, but they'd remained invisible and mysterious until the mathematical framework I'd developed provided a way to understand their behavior. It was satisfying to contribute something meaningful to humanity's understanding of its cosmic context. My father approached with the expression of someone who'd realized that his fundamental assumptions about reality might need revision. Son, he said quietly, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you an acknowledgement that I completely misunderstood what you were working on and why it mattered. The misunderstanding had been natural and even reasonable. Theoretical physics research looked like unemployment to people unfamiliar with how scientific breakthroughs actually happened. The work required long periods of apparent inactivity while mathematical concepts developed slowly in the background of consciousness. Roberto was reading what appeared to be an analysis of the economic implications of unified field theory. Miguel, it says here that your research could lead to technological advances that revolutionize transportation, energy production, and space exploration. He looked at me with something approaching disbelief. Are you going to change how humans live in the universe? The technological possibilities were intriguing but remained speculative. Understanding how dark matter influenced space-time geometry could potentially lead to new approaches to propulsion and energy generation, but the engineering challenges would require decades of additional research by teams of scientists and engineers. Elena was reading what appeared to be international reaction to the Nobel Prize announcement. Miguel, it says here that physicists around the world are calling your work a watershed moment for human understanding of reality. She looked at me with something approaching awe. You've basically advanced human civilization. The advancement was collective rather than individual. Unified field theory built on centuries of previous discoveries by thousands of researchers. My contribution had been to develop mathematical tools that could synthesize existing knowledge into a more complete picture. But that work had only been possible because of the foundation laid by the entire scientific community. David found a video of my Nobel Prize acceptance speech rehearsal. Miguel, you're explaining how your research connects to the biggest questions about existence and humanity's place in the cosmos. He looked around the table. You're basically a philosopher of the universe. The philosophical implications were indeed profound. Understanding how matter and energy interacted at cosmic scales inevitably led to questions about consciousness, free will, and the nature of reality itself. Physics had always existed at the intersection of mathematics and metaphysics. My mother, who'd spent dinner advocating for practical employment, was reading what appeared to be predictions about my future career. Miguel, she said slowly, it says here that Nobel Prize winners typically become some of the most influential people in their fields and often serve as advisors to governments and international organizations. The influence was a responsibility rather than a privilege. Scientific understanding carried obligations to help humanity make informed decisions about its future development. The research would be meaningful only if it contributed to human flourishing rather than merely satisfying intellectual curiosity. As the family continued processing this unexpected revelation, I reflected on the strange trajectory that had led from childhood questions about stars to mathematical descriptions of cosmic evolution. The Nobel Prize represented validation from the international physics community, but it also marked the beginning of new responsibilities and challenges. My phone buzzed with another call, this time from the president's science advisor, requesting a briefing on the national security implications of unified field theory. I answered on the second ring. This is Dr. Martinez. The conversation that followed involved classified applications of dark matter research and requests for immediate consultation on federal science policy. As I discussed technical details with government officials, I could see my family listening with the expression of people discovering that their understanding of the world had been fundamentally incomplete. When I ended the call, the dining room was completely silent again. That was the White House, I said simply. My father stared at me for a long moment, then began to laugh. It wasn't bitter laughter or embarrassed laughter. It was the laughter of someone who'd just realized that reality was far more interesting than they'd imagined. Miguel, he said finally, I think we need to have a very different conversation about your career.